Agent Thomas Wilson stared in disbelief at the woman who had called in a terrorist gathering. Now she trembled before the governor and his bride. Her smug expression crumbled as Governor Raymond Mitchell announced, "Mrs. Raymond Mitchell Henderson, your discrimination lawsuit begins Monday. I promise justice when elected, starting with you." Before we dive into this shocking story of racial profiling gone wrong, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed someone's prejudice backfire spectacularly, and subscribe to catch more true stories of justice being served. Now, let's rewind to see how a peaceful wedding day turned into a national scandal that changed lives forever. Raymond Mitchell, 38 years old, and making history as the first black governor of Virginia, had faced countless obstacles throughout his political career, but planning his wedding shouldn't have been one of them. As he stood in the sprawling backyard of his family's historic estate, in the affluent, predominantly white neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, he could almost see his vision coming to life, an intimate ceremony beneath the ancient oak trees, surrounded only by those dearest to him and his bride. His fiancée, Dr. Amara Collins, 35, had specifically requested a small, private ceremony away from the relentless media attention that followed them everywhere. As one of the country's most renowned neurosurgeons who had pioneered a revolutionary approach to treating previously inoperable brain tumors, Amara deserved a day where she wasn't Dr. Collins or the governor's fiancée, but simply a woman marrying the man she loved. "What do you think about setting up the ceremony right here?" Raymond asked, pointing to a flat area beneath the largest oak tree. "Your grandmother would have loved that," Amara replied, squeezing his hand. The estate held special significance for Raymond, having belonged to his grandmother Eloise Mitchell, who had worked as a maid for the previous owners, the Whitmores, for over 30 years before eventually purchasing it herself in the 1982, when Mr. Whitmore fell on hard times and offered to sell it to her at a price well below market value, a fact that had created lasting resentment among some longtime residents who believed the property should have remained in the right hands. Raymond's security team, led by former Marine Captain Sophia Reynolds, walked the perimeter planning discreet protection protocols that would maintain the privacy and intimacy of the event while ensuring the governor's safety. "We'll have plainclothes officers stationed here, here, and here," Captain Reynolds explained, marking points on a digital map of the property. "The trees provide natural cover, but also create blind spots we'll need to monitor." From the neighboring property, Eleanor Henderson, 62, peered through her kitchen window at the group of people walking around the Mitchell estate. She had lived in her house for 30 years, and still remembered when that woman had moved in next door, disrupting what had been in her mind a perfect neighborhood. Eleanor watched as delivery trucks began arriving, dropping off equipment for tents, catering supplies, and furniture. She meticulously noted each arrival in a small notebook, documenting the time, company name, and most tellingly detailed descriptions that emphasized the race of each worker. "Another van just arrived," she muttered into her phone. "Third one today. 4 black men unloading some kind of equipment. This is getting out of hand." On the other end of the line, her neighbor Patricia sighed audibly. "Eleanor, maybe they're just doing renovations." The property was empty, for years after the old woman died. "Renovations don't require this many people coming and going at all hours," Eleanor snapped. "They're up to something. I'm telling you, there goes the neighborhood." Meanwhile, Raymond's sister Vivian Mitchell, 42, a formidable civil rights attorney who had made a name for herself fighting housing discrimination cases, oversaw the wedding arrangements with meticulous attention to detail. She noticed the neighbor with the camera almost immediately. "Looks like we've got an audience," she mentioned casually to Raymond as they reviewed the seating chart. Raymond glanced toward Eleanor's house and nodded unsurprised. "Some things never change," he said. "Remember when we were kids visiting Grandma and the neighbors called the police about suspicious children playing in the yard?" Vivian laughed without humor. "How could I forget first time I was ever handcuffed? I was 12. The memory solidified Raymond's resolve. His chief of staff had suggested using the governor's mansion for the ceremony. It would be easier to secure, more prestigious, and frankly less complicated. But Raymond had been adamant. "This place is part of our family legacy," he told Vivian as they walked back inside. "Grandma worked her fingers to the bone cleaning this house for decades before she could buy it. She endured harassment and threats rather than give it up. I'm not having my wedding anywhere else." As the sun began to set, Eleanor Henderson picked up her phone again, this time calling another neighbor. "Jim, it's Eleanor. I'm organizing a neighborhood watch meeting tomorrow. We need to discuss the situation next door." By the time she'd finished making calls, Eleanor had gathered commitments from 5 neighbors to attend her impromptu meeting about monitoring the suspicious activity at the Mitchell estate. As she was hanging up from her last call, she overheard a fragment of conversation between 2 workers loading equipment back into their truck. "Everything needs to be perfect when the governor arrives on Friday," one said to the other. Eleanor froze, then slowly smiled. So, they were expecting a governor, likely from some foreign country, she assumed, completely misinterpreting the conversation. This confirmed her suspicions that something unusual was happening. She hurried inside to add this new intelligence to her growing file of observations. The following evening, Eleanor's living room hosted her hastily formed neighborhood watch group. "I've called you all here because I'm concerned about the security of our community." She began standing before a corkboard where she'd pinned photos of delivery trucks and workers at the Mitchell estate. "There's clearly some kind of large gathering being planned next door, and they're expecting someone they referred to as the governor to arrive tomorrow." Among those present was Walter Brooks, a 68-year-old retired high school history teacher who had moved to the neighborhood after his wife's death 3 years earlier. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not entirely convinced there was cause for alarm, but feeling a vague sense of civic duty to at least listen. "Eleanor, what exactly are you suggesting we do?" he asked. "I'm not sure we need to be concerned about private events at a private residence." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Walter, you're new here. You don't understand the history. That property has always been a problem since it changed hands." She didn't need to elaborate on what she meant by changed hands. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. "I propose we create a rotation schedule to monitor all comings and goings." Eleanor continued, undeterred. "I've created a log system where we can document vehicles, descriptions of visitors, and any unusual activities." She distributed printed sheets with columns for date, time, vehicle, description, number of people, and other observations. From the kitchen, Eleanor's husband Frank, 65, a recently retired accountant with thinning white hair and perpetually tired eyes, watched the proceedings with growing concern. When the neighbors had left, each reluctantly agreeing to take shifts observing the Mitchell property, Frank confronted his wife. "Eleanor, this is going too far. These people have a right to privacy. You're going to get yourself in trouble." Eleanor dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Frank, if they have nothing to hide, they have nothing to worry about. Someone needs to keep an eye on things around here. Property values are at stake." The next morning, Eleanor began her self-appointed surveillance in earnest. She photographed license plates of every vehicle that arrived at the Mitchell estate using a telephoto lens from her upstairs window. She noted the time of arrival and departure of each visitor and created detailed descriptions that invariably mentioned race as a primary identifier. By midday, her activities had not gone unnoticed. One of the private security consultants, hired by Raymond's team, spotted the camera lens reflecting sunlight from the neighbor's window and alerted Captain Reynolds. "Sir, we have active surveillance from the property to the east," the consultant reported. "Civilian appears to be photographing arrivals and departures." Captain Reynolds brought this information to Raymond immediately. "Governor, we have a situation you should be aware of." She showed Raymond photos of Eleanor's house and explained what they'd observed. Raymond sighed deeply, but wasn't surprised. "She's harmless, Sophia. Annoying, but harmless. Let's not escalate the situation unless absolutely necessary. This weekend is about Amara and me, not neighborhood politics." Captain Reynolds nodded reluctantly. "We'll maintain awareness, sir, but won't engage unless her actions become more concerning." Later that afternoon, Amara arrived at the estate driving herself in her modest sedan, despite Raymond's offers to send a car. She valued her independence fiercely, a quality Raymond had fallen in love with when they first met at a charity gala 3 years earlier. As Amara unpacked groceries from her trunk, she noticed a woman across the street, seemingly photographing her. Thinking it might be paparazzi, Amara turned her back and continued unloading her car. Minutes later, while selecting produce at Oakwood Market, the local grocery store, Amara sensed someone following her. Looking up from the tomatoes she was examining, she caught Eleanor Henderson quickly averting her gaze. Amara continued her shopping, selecting ingredients for a special dinner she planned to cook for Raymond that evening. At the checkout, as Amara paid for her groceries, Eleanor approached a store security guard, speaking just loudly enough for Amara to overhear. "That woman has been behaving suspiciously," Eleanor said, pointing discreetly at Amara. "She's been wandering around the store for an hour, examining everything. I think you should check her bags." The security guard, a young man named Trevor, who had worked at the market for years, recognized Amara immediately. "Ma'am, that's Dr. Collins, the governor's fiancée," he said loud enough for several nearby customers to hear. "She shops here regularly." Eleanor's face flushed, but she stood her ground. "I highly doubt that's who she is. Anyone could claim to be someone important." By now, the store manager had approached, horrified by what was unfolding. "Dr. Collins, I am so sorry for the misunderstanding," he said, glaring at Eleanor. "Please accept our apologies for any inconvenience." Amara handled the situation with grace. "No harm done," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand concerns about security." She collected her groceries and left, while Eleanor huffed away, unconvinced of Amara's identity despite multiple confirmations. When Amara returned to the estate and told Raymond about the incident, he held her close, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and resignation. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," he said softly. "When I was running for state senate, a police officer detained me in the parking lot of my own campaign office because someone reported a suspicious man entering the building after hours." Amara nodded against his chest. "In my first year as chief of neurosurgery, a patient refused to let me operate on him because he didn't believe I was really the doctor. Asked for my credentials 3 times before asking for the real doctor to come in." They shared a sad laugh, the kind that comes from a place of shared pain transformed into resilience. "It's why getting married here matters so much," Raymond said, gesturing to the estate around them. "My grandmother refused to be driven away by people who thought she didn't belong. This place is our statement that we belong anywhere we choose to be." Amara kissed him softly. "Then, it's perfect. And no nosy neighbor is going to ruin that for us." What drives someone to become so fixated on monitoring their neighbors? What invisible boundaries exist in neighborhoods across America that some believe must never be crossed? If you've ever experienced racial profiling or witnessed someone being treated unfairly based on their appearance, comment number 1 below. And if you believe everyone deserves to feel safe and welcome in their own neighborhood, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to hear more stories that expose the painful reality of discrimination in everyday life. Now let's discover just how far Eleanor Henderson was willing to go to protect what she considered her territory. Eleanor Henderson wasn't content with mere visual surveillance anymore. She needed information background, something concrete to justify her growing obsession with the activities next door. Late one night while Frank slept, she hunched over her laptop researching the property's history. What she discovered both shocked and angered her. The estate had indeed belonged to the Mitchell family for nearly 40 years. News articles from the 1982nd detailed how Eloise Mitchell, a longtime domestic worker for the previous owners, had purchased the property complete with photographs showing a dignified black woman in her 60s, standing proudly in Prude, front of the colonial-style mansion. Eleanor scrolled further, finding more recent articles mentioning the estate in connection with Governor Raymond Mitchell, who occasionally referenced his grandmother's journey from domestic worker to property owner as part of his planks. Personal narrative. "It can't be," Eleanor whispered to herself, refusing to accept the connection. "That's not the same Mitchell family." But deeper research confirmed her worst fear. The mysterious gathering next door was indeed connected to the governor himself. Rather than calming her suspicions, this discovery inflamed them. In Eleanor's distorted worldview, this wasn't a simple wedding, but something more sinister, perhaps a political scheme or illegal fundraising event disguised as a private ceremony. The next morning, Eleanor made a call to her nephew James Parker, a 41-year-old administrator at the FBI field office in Richmond. James wasn't an agent himself, but worked in a support role that gave him access to certain databases and filing systems. "Aunt Eleanor, I've told you before I can't just run background checks on your neighbors," James said with exasperation when she explained what she wanted. "That's not how this works. That's not what the FBI does." "James, I'm not asking for a simple background check," Eleanor insisted. "I have reason to believe there's a large gathering of foreign nationals occurring at the old Mitchell place. They mentioned someone called the governor is coming. This could be a matter of national security." James sighed heavily. He'd always found his aunt's paranoia exhausting, but the mention of foreign officials piqued his professional interest despite his better judgment. Ambitious and always looking for ways to advance his middling career, James saw a potential opportunity. "I'll see what I come across in the regular course of my duties," he said carefully, not committing to anything explicitly unethical, but leaving the door open. "But Aunt Eleanor, don't do anything rash. If you seriously suspect illegal activity, the proper channels would be local police, not taking matters into your own hands." After hanging up, James began a series of unauthorized database searches, looking for any intelligence on foreign dignitaries visiting Virginia that weekend. He found nothing, but did discover that Governor Mitchell had cleared his official calendar for personal time information that should have immediately connected to Eleanor's concerns had James been more thorough or less blinded by his own ambition. Meanwhile, Walter Brooks was having second thoughts about his involvement in Eleanor's neighborhood watch scheme. After doing his own research and recognizing Governor Mitchell's connection to the estate, he felt a deep sense of shame for allowing himself to be pulled into what was clearly racial profiling. As a history teacher, he had taught his students about the civil rights movement, about the systemic discrimination that had shaped American society. Now he found himself complicit in the very behaviors he had condemned in his classroom. That afternoon, Walter made the difficult decision to walk over to the Mitchell estate and speak directly with whoever was in charge. He was surprised when a security officer actually escorted him to the back patio where Raymond Mitchell himself was reviewing seating arrangements. "Governor Mitchell," Walter said, extending his hand nervously. "I'm Walter Brooks, your neighbor from 3 doors down. I owe you an apology." Raymond stood and shook Walter's hand firmly, his expression curious but not unwelcoming. "What are you apologizing for, Mr. Brooks?" Walter explained his brief involvement in Eleanor's surveillance efforts and his subsequent realization of what was actually happening. "I should have known better," he concluded. "I let myself get caught up in something ugly, and I'm deeply sorry." Instead of responding with anger, Raymond offered Walter a seat. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Brooks. It takes courage to admit a mistake." They spoke for nearly 30 minutes discussing the neighborhood, Raymond's grandmother, and the wedding plans. Before Walter left, Raymond made a surprising gesture. "We're keeping the ceremony small, but I'd like to invite you to join us. Maybe seeing a friendly face from the neighborhood would be a nice addition." Walter accepted, deeply moved by the governor's graciousness in the face of his own failure of character. From her window, Eleanor watched this interaction with mounting fury. She had seen Walter enter the property, and now observed him chatting with a black man as if they were old friends. When Walter finally left, Eleanor was waiting at his front door. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "You were supposed to be documenting activities, not socializing with them." Walter stood straight, finding a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "Eleanor, you need to stop this. That's Governor Mitchell's family property. They're planning his wedding, not whatever conspiracy you've invented." Eleanor's face contorted with disbelief. "That's ridiculous. Why would the governor get married in this neighborhood instead of the governor's mansion?" "Because his grandmother owned that house," Walter replied firmly. "And I've been invited to the wedding. I suggest you drop this surveillance nonsense before you embarrass yourself further." Eleanor watched Walter walk into his house, slamming the door behind him. Rather than causing her to reconsider her actions, this betrayal as she saw it only strengthened her resolve. That evening she called her nephew again. "James, I need you to dig deeper. One of my neighbors has been compromised." James was growing increasingly uncomfortable with his aunt's requests. "Aunt Eleanor, I found nothing suspicious. The governor has personal time scheduled this weekend. That's all. I could lose my job if I keep making unauthorized inquiries." Eleanor's voice hardened. "James, think about this. If there is something happening, and you're the one who uncovers it, that's not a reprimand, that's a promotion. That's the field agent position you've been wanting for years." The manipulation worked. James reluctantly agreed to continue his unofficial investigation, despite the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. The following day, Amara's parents arrived from Nigeria, adding new fuel to Eleanor's xenophobic paranoia. Dr. Emmanuel and Falami Collins were distinguished academics, he a renowned economist, and she a celebrated cultural anthropologist. But to Eleanor, they were simply more foreigners infiltrating her neighborhood. She documented their arrival with particular attention to their traditional Nigerian clothing, which Falami had worn for the special occasion of seeing her daughter before her wedding day. Determined to find more concrete evidence to support her suspicions, Eleanor took her investigation to a new level. Using her husband's retired accountant credentials, she accessed county property records online, discovering the full history of the estate's ownership. She learned how the property had passed from the Whitmore family to Eloise Mitchell in 1983, at a price significantly below market value due to Mr. Syme VII. Whitmore's financial troubles and his genuine affection for his longtime housekeeper. For Eleanor, this transaction represented everything wrong with the neighborhood's evolution. In her mind, the property had been effectively stolen from its rightful owners, despite all evidence of a legal willing sale. This discovery crystallized Eleanor's resentment into something even darker and more dangerous than before. What began as neighborhood nosiness had transformed into a personal crusade fueled by deep-seated racism she wouldn't even acknowledge to herself. The day before the wedding arrived with perfect early autumn weather, the kind of crisp, sunny day that photographers dream about. The Mitchell estate hummed with activity as final preparations accelerated. Workers erected a small, elegant tent on the lawn to serve as a reception area, while florists wove garlands of white roses and greenery along the ancient oak tree that would serve as the wedding altar. Inside the house, caterers prepared a menu that blended traditional American cuisine with Nigerian specialties, honoring both families' heritage. Amara's family gathered in the East Garden for a traditional Nigerian blessing ceremony. Her parents, siblings, and extended family members wore vibrant traditional attire in rich purples, blues, and golds that contrasted beautifully with the estate's manicured greenery. They formed a circle around Amara, offering prayers and blessings in Yoruba, while her father performed a symbolic anointment with oils brought specifically from their hometown in Nigeria. The ceremony included music from talking drums and joyful singing that carried across the property. From her strategic observation post at her upstairs window, Eleanor Henderson documented every moment of this cultural tradition with growing alarm. In her detailed logbook, she described what she was witnessing as suspicious rituals and possible coded communications. She recorded video on her phone, zooming in as close as her consumer-grade technology would allow, capturing faces of family members and fragments of the Yoruba language being spoken. Eleanor's interpretation of these events was so divorced from reality that she began constructing elaborate conspiracy theories. The colorful traditional clothing became unusual uniforms, the talking drums became devices for sending signals, and the family circle became a tactical formation. Raymond's security detail, led by Captain Sophia Reynolds, was well aware of Eleanor's continued surveillance. From their professional perspective, the middle-aged woman taking photos from her window represented a nuisance rather than a threat, but the persistent nature of her behavior was becoming concerning. Governor Captain Reynolds said, as she approached Raymond while he reviewed final security arrangements, "Our neighbor continues her documentation efforts. Her activity has increased significantly today with the arrival of Dr. Collins' family. I recommend we send someone to speak with her directly before tomorrow." Raymond considered the suggestion while watching Amara laugh with her sisters, the sound filling him with joy, despite the underlying tension of the situation. Let's not create conflict unless absolutely necessary, Captain. Tomorrow is about Amara and me, not neighborhood politics. If Mrs. Henderson crosses onto the property or makes any direct contact, then we'll address it. Otherwise, let her take her pictures. They'll make boring viewing." Captain Reynolds nodded reluctantly. "As you wish, sir. We'll maintain awareness without engagement." She made a note to position additional plainclothes security near the property line shared with the Henderson home just in case. Meanwhile, in the Henderson household, a different kind of confrontation was brewing. Frank Henderson had returned early from his golf game and discovered Eleanor's extensive documentation spread across their home office desk. Pages of notes detailing the comings and goings of suspicious individuals, photographs with racial descriptions scrawled across them, and maps of the Mitchell property with observation points marked created a disturbing collage of obsession. Frank picked up Eleanor's logbook and flipped through pages of increasingly paranoid observations. With growing horror, he realized his wife had crossed from neighborhood busybody into something much more sinister. The sound of Eleanor entering the house prompted Frank to confront her immediately. "What the hell is all this?" he demanded, gesturing to the materials spread across the desk. "You told me you were just keeping an eye on things, not creating a surveillance dossier. Do you realize this could be considered harassment?" Stalking Eleanor set down her camera with deliberate calm. "I'm documenting suspicious activities, Frank. Someone needs to pay attention to what's happening in our neighborhood. This isn't neighborhood watch, Eleanor. This is obsession. And frankly, it looks like racial profiling." Frank held up a page where Eleanor had written detailed descriptions emphasizing the race of every person who had entered the Mitchell estate. "I spoke with Walter today. He told me that's Governor Mitchell's family property, and they're preparing for his wedding. His wedding, Eleanor. Not whatever international conspiracy you've invented." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Walter's been compromised. He can't see what's really happening." "No, you can't see what's really happening." Frank's voice rose with uncharacteristic anger. "You're creating problems where none exist, because you can't accept that black people can own property in this neighborhood, can be successful, can be in positions of power. I've ignored your comments for years, made excuses for your behavior, but this is too far." He gestured to the documentation again. "If the governor's security team saw this, you could be investigated. If this got out publicly, my God, Eleanor, do you understand how this would look?" Eleanor refused to back down. "If I'm right—" "But you're not right," Frank interrupted, "and I can't support this anymore. Either you stop this right now, throw all this away and apologize to the Mitchells tomorrow, or I'm leaving. I mean it, Eleanor. I won't be party to this." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, their 43-year marriage suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Eleanor stared at her husband, searching his face for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Finding none, she simply said, "You'll see that I'm right, Frank. When everything comes to light, you'll regret not standing by me." Frank shook his head sadly, already mentally packing his bags. At the FBI field office, James Parker was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. His unauthorized searches had yielded nothing suspicious about activities at the Mitchell estate, only confirmation that the governor was indeed taking personal time that weekend. The rational part of James' mind knew he should stop, that continuing to investigate based solely on his aunt's paranoia could end his career. But ambition and a lifetime of responding to Eleanor's manipulation kept him involved despite his better judgment. When his phone rang with Eleanor's name on the display, he almost didn't answer. "James, I need you to do one more thing for me," Eleanor said without preamble when he finally picked up. "I need you to drive by the Mitchell place tomorrow morning. Just observe the gathering, and tell me if you see anything concerning from a law enforcement perspective." James recognized this as a transparent attempt to get official-seeming validation for her suspicions, but he was tired of arguing. "Fine, Aunt Eleanor. I'll drive by on my way to the office. But that's it. No more database searches, no official inquiries, just a drive-by observation as a private citizen who happens to work for the FBI." After hanging up, James stared at his computer screen, contemplating the ethical lines he'd already crossed. As a final precaution, he deleted his search history, hoping to erase evidence of his misconduct. Back at the governor's estate, Raymond's staff had completed final security arrangements for the wedding. Local police had been briefed about the event and potential interference from neighbors, particularly Eleanor Henderson, whose behavior had been documented by the security team. Detective Marcus Williams of the Oakwood Heights Police Department reviewed the information with professional interest. "We'll have 2 patrol cars doing regular passes of the area tomorrow," he assured Captain Reynolds. "From what you've described, Mrs. Henderson sounds like a nuisance rather than a threat, but we'll keep an eye out for any escalation." What no one could have predicted was that Eleanor had taken her campaign to a new level. Throughout the evening, she had been sending emails containing her evidence to various law enforcement agencies, including local police, state police, the FBI field office addressed to officials other than her nephew, and even the Department of Paramus. Homeland Security. Each message contained increasingly exaggerated claims about suspicious gatherings and potential security threats to the governor, carefully worded to trigger security protocols without explicitly making false statements she could be held legally accountable for. As night fell over Oakwood Heights, 2 very different scenes unfolded in neighboring houses. At the Mitchell estate, Raymond and Amara shared a quiet moment on the patio, looking up at the stars and envisioning their future together. Next door, Eleanor Henderson sat alone in her office, the blue light of her computer screen illuminating her determined face as she made one final attempt to disrupt what she couldn't accept. A black family establishing their legacy in what she still considered her exclusive domain. Dawn broke over the Mitchell estate with golden light filtering through the ancient oak trees, nature itself seeming to bless the day ahead. By 7 in the morning, the property buzzed with purposeful activity as the final wedding preparations came together. Catering staff arranged elegant place settings beneath the reception tent. Florists made last-minute adjustments to floral arrangements, and Raymond's security team conducted their final perimeter check, all operating with the reception tent florists. Precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Inside the main house, Raymond's closest friends and family gathered in the spacious living room, converted temporarily into a staging area for the wedding party. Raymond's best man, Michael Washington, his roommate from law school, and now a federal judge, adjusted his bow tie while reminiscing about their days as struggling students. "Remember that apartment we shared in our second year, the one where the heat only worked every other day?" Michael laughed, clapping Raymond on the shoulder. "Look at us now. You running the state, me on the bench, and both of us still trying to figure out how to tie these damn bow ties properly." The room filled with warm laughter as other groomsmen shared stories, creating an atmosphere of joyful camaraderie that helped calm Raymond's pre-wedding nerves. In another wing of the house, Amara prepared with her bridesmaids, her sisters, Fulami and Adana, and her best friend from medical school, Dr. Jennifer Chen. As her mother carefully placed a family heirloom necklace around her neck, delicate gold filigree that had been passed down through 4 generations, Amara reflected on her journey. "When I first came to America for medical school, I never imagined this day," she said softly. "There were times during my residency when patients would refuse to let me treat them, when colleagues would question my abilities despite my credentials. Each time I had to prove myself all over again." Her sister Fulami squeezed her hand. "And yet here you are, one of the top neurosurgeons in the country, about to marry the governor. You've overcome every obstacle." Amara smiled, thinking of Raymond. "We both have. That's what connected us from the beginning, understanding each other's struggles without having to explain them." From her observation post at her upstairs window, Eleanor Henderson had been documenting arrivals since sunrise. She noted with particular interest the security personnel stationed discreetly around the property perimeter, mistaking the governor's standard protection detail for something more sinister. When the official state vehicles arrived carrying additional security staff, Eleanor's suspicions reached new heights. "Frank, look at this," she called to her husband, who was packing a suitcase in their bedroom, making good on his threat to leave. "They have armed men positioned all around the property. I told you this wasn't just a wedding." Frank paused in his packing to glance out the window. "Those are the governor's security detail, Eleanor. Every governor has protection. This proves nothing except that you're seeing what you want to see. He returned to his packing, determined to be gone before the situation escalated further. Eleanor barely registered his response, too focused on documenting license plate numbers of newly arriving vehicles. As distinguished guests began to arrive, state senators, federal judges, university presidents, and business leaders, Eleanor failed to recognize them as the prominent figures they were. Instead, she categorized them in her notebook, primarily by race missing, entirely the significance of their positions or connections to the governor. By mid-morning, the guest list had expanded to include U.S. Senator James Williams, 3 state Supreme Court justices, the presidents of 2 major universities, and several prominent business leaders who had supported Raymond's campaign. The growing number of state vehicles and security personnel finally pushed Eleanor to take more direct action. She picked up her phone and began calling emergency services. Her first call was to the local police department. "There's a large gathering at the Mitchell estate with armed individuals present," she reported, careful to mention the presence of weapons to ensure a rapid response. When the dispatcher explained that they were aware of the governor's wedding and the security was authorized, Eleanor hung up and tried the state police, then the FBI field office, receiving similar responses from each. Frustrated but undeterred, Eleanor made a critical error in judgment. She called 911 again, this time escalating her claims dramatically. "I need to report a security threat at the Mitchell estate in Oakwood Heights," she said, her voice tight with determination. "I believe the governor may be in danger. There are foreign nationals conducting unusual activities, and I've observed what appear to be unauthorized armed individuals surrounding the property." The mention of a potential threat to the governor automatically triggered an emergency response protocol. The 911 dispatcher immediately elevated the call, alerting multiple agencies simultaneously, as required by procedure when the safety of a high-ranking government official might be compromised. Within minutes, what had been a carefully planned, intimate wedding ceremony began transforming into something entirely different. Inside the house, Raymond shared a private moment with his mother, Esther Mitchell, a strong, dignified woman who had raised Raymond and Vivian alone after their father's death from cancer 20 years earlier. Esther had worked 3 jobs simultaneously to support her children and put them through college cleaning houses during the day, bookkeeping for a small business in the evenings, and weekend shifts at a nursing home. "Your father would be so proud today," she said, straightening Raymond's tie with hands that showed every year of their hard work. "Not just of the governor, but of the man you've become." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box. "He wanted you to have this on your wedding day." Inside was his father's pocket watch, a simple but elegant timepiece that had been the only luxury William Mitchell had ever allowed himself. "He saved for 2 years to buy this," Esther explained. "Said a man should have one thing of quality to pass down to his children." Raymond carefully took the watch, feeling the weight of its history and meaning. "I miss him every day," he said softly, "especially today." "He's here," Esther assured him, placing her hand over his heart. "Right here, where he's always been." Their moment was interrupted by Captain Reynolds entering the room with an urgent expression. "Governor, we have a situation developing." Outside, the first police cruisers were arriving in response to Eleanor's call, lights flashing but sirens silent as they approached the estate. From her window, Eleanor watched with satisfaction as her report was finally being taken seriously. She failed to understand that her false report had set in motion a security response that could have dangerous consequences. As law enforcement officers approached the property, they were met by members of the governor's security detail, creating initial confusion as jurisdictions and protocols overlapped. Meanwhile, Eleanor made one final call, this time to her nephew James. "They're finally responding," she told him triumphantly. "You need to get here now to see what's happening." James, who had been reluctantly preparing to drive by the estate as promised, felt a surge of alarm at his aunt's tone. "What did you do, Aunt Eleanor?" he demanded. "Nothing that wasn't necessary," she replied cryptically before hanging up. With growing dread, James grabbed his credentials and keys, rushing to his car with the sinking feeling that his aunt had just done something that would have serious repercussions for everyone involved, himself included. What would you do if your prejudice led to consequences far beyond what you ever imagined? Have you ever witnessed someone's discrimination backfire in a way that exposed their true character? Comment number 1. Below if you believe people who make false reports should face serious consequences. Or comment number 2 if you think education and community service would be more effective. Hit that like button if you've ever stood up against discrimination in your own community, and subscribe to hear more stories about justice prevailing in unexpected ways. Now let's see how Eleanor Henderson's false alarm creates chaos on what should have been a perfect wedding day. Eleanor Henderson's call reporting a potential threat to the governor triggered an emergency response protocol that cascaded through multiple law enforcement agencies. Her deliberate mention of the governor being in potential danger activated a highest priority security alert that bypassed normal verification procedures. Within minutes of her call, the Oakwood Heights Police Department dispatched 6 patrol cars to the scene. The Virginia State Police redirected 4 highway patrol units to the Mitchell estate. Most significantly, the FBI field office mobilized a rapid response team specialized in handling threats to government officials. All units were converging on what they believed was a possible security crisis involving the state's highest-ranking elected official. James Parker received the alert on his phone while driving toward his aunt's neighborhood. The official notification sent to all FBI personnel described a credible threat to Governor Mitchell at a private residence in Oakwood Heights. With sickening clarity, James realized what his aunt had done. She hadn't simply reported suspicious activity, she had fabricated a threat to the governor, one of the most serious false reports possible. He tried calling Eleanor repeatedly, but received no answer. Accelerating, he raced toward Oakwood Heights, hoping to somehow mitigate the disaster unfolding because of his aunt's actions and his own failure to take her obsession seriously. At the Mitchell estate, what had been a perfectly orchestrated wedding ceremony was suddenly thrown into confusion. Raymond and Amara had been minutes away from beginning their procession to the oak tree altar when Captain Reynolds received the security alert. "Governor, we have multiple law enforcement agencies responding to a reported threat against you," she informed Raymond, her training keeping her voice steady despite the seriousness of the situation. "We need to move you and Dr. Collins to a secure location immediately." Raymond's face hardened with understanding. "Is there an actual threat, or is this?" He left the question unfinished, but Captain Reynolds understood his meaning. "We're verifying now, sir, but protocol requires we treat it as credible until confirmed otherwise." She turned to her team. "Secure the principals. Standard protection formation." Within seconds, security personnel surrounded Raymond and Amara, creating a protective barrier as they escorted them away from the ceremony area and toward the house. Guests watched in confusion as the wedding party was suddenly dispersed. Outside the property gates, the first police vehicles arrived, with lights flashing, creating an immediate sense of alarm. State police cruisers pulled up moments later, followed by unmarked FBI vehicles. Law enforcement officers emerged with weapons, ready, establishing a perimeter around the estate as they'd been trained to do in potential threat situations. From her window, Eleanor watched with mounting satisfaction as her call produced the response she'd been seeking for days. She recorded video of the police arrival, certain that her concerns were finally being validated. What she failed to grasp was the seriousness of what she had set in motion. Not just a routine check of suspicious activity, but a full-scale security response that put everyone involved at risk. Inside the house, Raymond made a quick decision. "This is my property and my wedding day," he told Captain Reynolds firmly. "I'm going out there to speak with law enforcement myself before this gets any further out of hand." Captain Reynolds objected strenuously, but Raymond's mind was made up. "Stay with Amara," he instructed. "I'll handle this." With 2 security team members flanking him, Raymond walked out the front door of the estate, hands clearly visible, to approach the gathering law enforcement officers. The first officers on scene immediately recognized the governor. Lieutenant Sarah Daniels of the Oakwood Heights Police Department lowered her weapon and stepped forward. "Governor Mitchell, sir, we received reports of a security threat against you at this location." Raymond shook his head, maintaining his composure despite his internal fury. "Lieutenant, there is no security threat here. This is my family's property, and today is my wedding day. It appears someone has made a false report. As Raymond spoke with Lieutenant Daniels explaining the situation, more police vehicles continued to arrive, creating a scene that attracted attention from neighbors and passing motorists. Several guests who had been arriving for the ceremony were stopped at police roadblocks, adding to the confusion and disruption. Captain Reynolds emerged from the house to provide identification and verification to the responding officers, confirming that the governor's security team had the situation under control and that there was no actual threat. Gradually, the tension began to ease, as law enforcement realized they were responding to a false alarm. FBI Special Agent Derek Morgan took charge of coordinating the multi-agency response, working quickly to de-escalate the situation while maintaining appropriate security protocols. "We need to identify the source of this report," he instructed his team. "False reports of this nature are a federal offense." It didn't take long for investigators to trace the 911 call to Eleanor Henderson's phone. As FBI agents approached her house, Eleanor was still recording the scene from her window, oblivious to the fact that she had become the focus of the investigation. The doorbell rang, startling Eleanor from her documentation. When she opened the door, she found herself facing two FBI agents who identified themselves and asked to speak with her regarding the emergency calls. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to ask you some questions about reports of a security threat at the Mitchell estate," Agent Lisa Chen said professionally, showing her credentials. "May we come in?" Eleanor's confidence began to waver as she realized these agents weren't there to investigate her concerns, but to question her actions. "I was just reporting suspicious activity," she said defensively, as she let them into her living room. "There's been unusual gatherings next door for days. Mrs. Zendace. Henderson, you specifically reported armed individuals threatening the governor," Agent Chen countered. "That's a very serious claim that activated an emergency response protocol involving multiple agencies and potentially endangered the governor by diverting security resources." As the agents continued questioning, Eleanor James Parker arrived at the scene, flashing his FBI credentials to pass through the police perimeter. He found his supervisor, Assistant Director Wilson, coordinating with local law enforcement. "Sir, I need to speak with you about this situation," James said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The woman who made the report is my aunt. I believe she's been fixated on activities at the governor's family estate for several days." Assistant Director Wilson's expression darkened. "You knew about this and didn't report it." James swallowed hard. "It's complicated, sir. I didn't realize how far she would take it. I may have contributed to the situation by checking some databases at her request." Wilson's face hardened. "We'll discuss your involvement later, Parker. For now, you're sidelined. Consider yourself on administrative leave pending investigation." As James stood there watching his career potentially crumble before his eyes, Frank Henderson returned home to find FBI agents questioning his wife in their living room. The suitcase he'd packed earlier still sat by the front door, a testament to how their marriage had already been fracturing before this final catastrophe. "What's happening?" he asked, though the scene before him made the answer painfully obvious. Agent Chen turned to Frank. "Sir, your wife made false reports to emergency services claiming a threat to Governor Mitchell's safety. We're investigating the circumstances of those reports." Frank's shoulders sagged as the full weight of the situation hit him. "I told her to stop," he said quietly. "I warned her this was going too far." Eleanor glared at her husband. "Frank, don't say anything more. They're twisting what happened. I was just reporting suspicious activity." "No, Eleanor," Frank said firmly. "You've been obsessed with the Mitchells since they started preparing for the wedding. This isn't about suspicious activity. This is about who they are and your refusal to accept them as neighbors." At the Mitchell estate, Raymond had made the difficult decision to temporarily postpone the wedding ceremony. Guests were asked to remain inside the main house while law enforcement completed their investigation and secured the area. Raymond found Amara in what had been designated as the bridal preparation room, still in her wedding dress, but surrounded by security personnel rather than bridesmaids. "I am so sorry," he said, taking her hands in his. "This should never have happened." Amara's expression was a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "It's not your fault, Raymond. We always knew being who we are doing what we do would make us targets sometimes." Her family gathered around them, offering support and comfort. Amara's father, Dr. Emmanuel Collins, placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder. In my country, we have a saying, "The tree that bears the sweetest fruit attracts the most stones." Your success threatens those who cling to old prejudices. Outside media vans had begun arriving, alerted by emergency scanner traffic about a security incident involving the governor. Captain Reynolds coordinated with the governor's press secretary to manage the developing media situation, while security teams worked to restore order and privacy to the estate. As news cameras began setting up on the street, Eleanor Henderson watched from her window as her actions transformed from private vendetta to public spectacle. She still refused to acknowledge the racial motivation behind her surveillance and false reports, insisting to the FBI agents questioning her that she was simply being a vigilant citizen. Her denial cracked only when Governor Mitchell himself approached her house, accompanied by FBI agents and his security detail. Having established that there was no legitimate security threat, Raymond had decided to confront the source of the disruption directly. Standing on Eleanor's front porch, as agents escorted her to the door, Raymond Mitchell embodied the full dignity of his office despite the personal affront he had suffered. Eleanor's smug expression crumbled as she recognized him from television appearances, finally forced to confront the reality that the man she had been surveilling and reporting was indeed the governor of Virginia. Mrs. Henderson. Raymond said, his voice steady and authoritative. "I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened here today." The confrontation that Eleanor Henderson had been unknowingly building toward for days finally arrived on her doorstep in the form of Governor Raymond Mitchell himself. Standing on her porch, flanked by FBI agents and his security detail, Raymond presented an imposing figure despite the personal indignity he had suffered. "Mrs. Henderson," he repeated when she remained frozen in shock. "May we come in? I think it's time we spoke directly rather than through law enforcement proxies." Eleanor found herself wordlessly stepping aside, allowing the governor and agents into her living room, where her husband Frank and nephew James already sat being questioned by FBI agents. The tension in the room was palpable as Eleanor finally came face to face with the man she had been obsessively monitoring and reporting. Governor Mitchell. Agent Chen said formally, "This is Eleanor Henderson, who made the emergency reports concerning your safety. We're still investigating the circumstances, but preliminary findings suggest the reports were without factual basis." Raymond nodded, his expression carefully neutral despite the anger he felt. "Mrs. Henderson, do you understand what your actions have caused today?" Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure, her worldview crumbling around her, as she faced not only the governor, but the consequences of her actions. "I was reporting suspicious activity," she insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "There were people coming and going at all hours. Foreign visitors, unusual gatherings. You mean my fiancée's Nigerian family performing traditional wedding blessings?" Raymond interrupted. "Or perhaps the caterers preparing for our wedding reception? Which of these ordinary activities seemed suspicious to you?" Mrs. Henderson. Eleanor had no adequate response. For days, she had been constructing an elaborate narrative of suspicion and threat, one that collapsed completely in the face of the simple reality before her. Frank Henderson stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Governor Mitchell, I want to apologize for my wife's actions. There's no excuse for what she's done." He turned to Eleanor. "This has to stop, Eleanor. Look at what you've caused with these false accusations. A wedding day ruined emergency services, diverted from real emergencies, our nephew's career in jeopardy, all because you couldn't accept having black neighbors." Eleanor flinched at her husband's blunt assessment. "That's not true," she protested weakly. "This isn't about race." "Isn't it?" Raymond asked quietly. "Mrs. Henderson, I grew up visiting this neighborhood. My grandmother worked as a maid in that house for 30 years before she was able to buy it. Every time I visited her as a child, someone in this neighborhood called the police about suspicious children on the property. Some things change, but some patterns remain disturbingly consistent." While this confrontation unfolded, James Parker faced his own reckoning with Assistant Director Wilson. "I access databases without authorization." James admitted his career ambitions crumbling before his eyes. I believed I was just checking for legitimate security concerns, but I should have reported my aunt's behavior immediately. Assistant Director Wilson's expression was stone. You compromised your position and the Bureau's integrity, Parker. Your actions facilitated a false report that endangered the governor by diverting security resources based on fabricated threats. This isn't just an administrative violation, it potentially rises to criminal misconduct. James nodded miserably, understanding that his career with the FBI was effectively over. I accept full responsibility for my actions, sir. Back at the Mitchell estate, Amara had taken charge of comforting distressed family members and reassuring guests while Raymond handled the confrontation with Eleanor. Despite her own disappointment at having her wedding day disrupted, Amara demonstrated the same grace under pressure that had served her well throughout her medical career. We will still be married today, she assured her parents and siblings. Perhaps not with the ceremony we planned, but with no less joy and commitment. Her mother, Folami, embraced her daughter. You have always found strength in difficulties. It is what makes you exceptional, my daughter. Outside, the estate media presence continued to grow as news vans lined the street and reporters attempted to piece together what had happened. Captain Reynolds worked with the governor's press secretary to manage information, confirming only that there had been a false alarm and that the governor was safe. Despite these efforts, live broadcasts had already begun, with reporters speculating about the nature of the security incident at the governor's family estate. When Raymond returned to the estate after confronting Eleanor, he found this media circus waiting for him. Rather than avoiding the cameras, he made a strategic decision to address the situation directly. Taking Amara's hand, he approached the media gathered at the estate entrance. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and dignified. "As you may have heard, our wedding ceremony was interrupted today by a false security alert. While disappointing on a personal level, this incident highlights issues that many Americans face every day, assumptions made based on appearance rather than character, suspicion rather than neighborliness." Amara stood beside him, her wedding dress gleaming in the afternoon sun as cameras captured their united front. "Today was meant to be a celebration of love and family," she added. "We still intend to celebrate, though not quite as planned. What happened today is unfortunately not unusual for many Americans of color, even those in positions of prominence." Their impromptu press conference projected strength and dignity in the face of disruption, transforming what could have been merely a personal affront into a powerful statement about persistent social issues. Back at the Henderson home, Eleanor watched this press conference on her living room television, the reality of her actions finally beginning to sink in. FBI agents had confiscated her notebooks, computer, and phone as evidence in their investigation of her false reports. Agent Chen explained the potential charges she faced. "Making false reports to emergency services is a serious offense, Mrs. Henderson. When those reports involve the safety of a government official and trigger multi-agency emergency protocols, the penalties can be severe. You're looking at potential federal charges." Eleanor sank into her sofa, the facade of righteous neighborhood vigilance completely shattered. Her husband Frank stood by the door, his packed suitcase still beside him. "I'll be staying with my brother for the foreseeable future," he said quietly. "I meant what I said earlier, Eleanor. I can't be part of this anymore." As Frank left, closing the door behind him, Eleanor found herself alone with the consequences of her actions. The neighborhood she had appointed herself to protect would now view her as a pariah. Her husband had left her. Her nephew's career was in ruins. And it had all stemmed from her inability to accept the simple reality of a black family belonging in what she had considered her neighborhood. Meanwhile, as evening approached, Raymond and Amara made a decision that transformed the day from one of disruption to one of triumph. With their original wedding plans in disarray, but their commitment to each other unshaken, they chose to complete their vows in a hastily rearranged ceremony on the back patio of the estate. Surrounded by their closest family members and friends, with Captain Reynolds and her security team forming a protective circle around the gathering, Raymond and Amara exchanged vows just as the sun began to set. "Today has not been what we planned," Raymond said, holding Amara's hands in his. "But perhaps it's exactly what we needed, a reminder of why our union matters, why standing together against prejudice matters, why creating our future in this place that means so much to my family matters. Amara smiled through tears that were now of joy rather than disappointment. Every obstacle we've faced has only made us stronger. Today is no different. I take you as my husband proudly, and without reservation, knowing that together we can face whatever comes next. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, applause erupted from their gathered loved ones. What Eleanor Henderson had intended as disruption had instead become a powerful testament to resilience and love that transcended prejudice. And as the evening news broadcast footage of the governor and his new bride addressing the media with dignity after the false alarm, Eleanor Henderson sat alone in her living room, finally confronting the truth about herself that she had denied for so long. The morning after Raymond and Amara's improvised wedding ceremony, the incident at Oakwood Heights dominated headlines across Virginia and quickly spread to national news outlets. Governor's wedding interrupted by racially motivated false alarm, read the Richmond Times-Dispatch front page. Cable news networks ran segments analyzing the incident, with political commentators and civil rights experts weighing in on its broader implications. Social media exploded with the hashtag #WeddingWhileBlack as thousands shared their own experiences of having ordinary activities viewed with suspicion because of their race. What had begun as one neighbor's personal vendetta had transformed overnight into a national conversation about racial profiling and its consequences. For Eleanor Henderson, the public revelation of her actions brought immediate repercussions. Her employer, Oakwood Heights Realty, where she had worked as an office manager for 15 years, placed her on indefinite administrative leave after her name appeared in news reports. The values displayed in this incident do not reflect those of our company, read their terse public statement. We are conducting an internal review while Miss Henderson addresses her legal situation. That legal situation grew more serious as investigators dug deeper into Eleanor's campaign against the Mitchell family. Her notebooks revealed a disturbing pattern of racial animus disguised as neighborhood concern. Entries consistently emphasized race as a primary identifier, with comments about maintaining neighborhood standards and protecting property values serving as thin veils for underlying prejudice. Most damaging were her documented calls to multiple law enforcement agencies, escalating her claims each time to ensure a response. Prosecutors were building a case that would include filing false reports, misuse of emergency services, and potentially hate crime enhancements, given the clear racial motivation behind her actions. James Parker faced his own professional implosion. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility launched a formal investigation into his unauthorized database searches and failure to report his aunt's increasingly concerning behavior. Placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation's outcome, James watched a promising career crumble because he had allowed family loyalty and personal ambition to override his professional ethics. His supervisor, Assistant Director Wilson, made the situation painfully clear during their final meeting before James surrendered his credentials. The Bureau can't have agents who selectively apply the law based on personal connections, Wilson explained. Your actions compromised an investigation and potentially endangered the governor by lending credibility to false reports. The damage to the FBI's reputation and public trust is incalculable. James nodded, accepting the harsh assessment. I understand, sir. I have no excuses. Walter Brooks, the retired history teacher who had briefly participated in Eleanor's neighborhood watch scheme before recognizing its true nature, felt compelled to make a public statement. In a letter to the editor published in the local newspaper, he wrote, I allowed myself to be drawn into monitoring activities at a neighbor's home based on vague concerns that in retrospect had no basis except the race of the pros. Homeowners. My brief participation shames me deeply as it contradicts everything I taught my students about civil rights and human dignity. I offer my sincere apology to Governor and Dr. Mitchell and pledge to work toward making our neighborhood truly welcoming to all. His candid acknowledgement of complicity and genuine remorse stood in stark contrast to Eleanor's continued attempts to justify her actions to investigators, claiming she had been motivated solely by concern for neighborhood Security. 3 days after the incident, while Eleanor faced mounting legal troubles and social ostracism, Raymond and Amara returned from a brief honeymoon at a secluded cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Rather than avoiding the controversy, they chose to address it head-on. Raymond scheduled a press conference at the governor's mansion with Amara by his side to discuss both the personal impact of the incident and its broader implications. "What happened on our wedding day is unfortunately not unusual," Raymond stated to the assembled press. "The only unusual aspect was that my position as governor brought immediate consequences for false reporting that most citizens would never receive. Every day across America, people of color have the police called on them for ordinary activities, barbecuing in parks, viewing houses for sale, sitting in coffee shops, or simply existing in spaces where others believe they don't belong." Amara, whose calm professional demeanor as a neurosurgeon served her well in this public role, added her perspective. "As healthcare professionals, we're taught to recognize and counteract implicit bias in medical treatment. But bias exists in every sector of society, often unacknowledged until incidents like this force a public reckoning. The disruption of our wedding was personally painful, but if it contributes to greater awareness and accountability, some good may come from it." Their measured, thoughtful response earned widespread praise, with political observers noting how Raymond had transformed a personal affront into an opportunity for meaningful public discourse about persistent social issues. Even political opponents acknowledged the dignity with which the governor and his wife had handled the situation. Within a week of the incident, journalists investigating Eleanor Henderson's background uncovered a pattern of similar complaints against minority residents in Oakwood Heights. Records showed she had called police at least 11 times in the past 5 years to report suspicious activity that inevitably involved people of color visiting or moving into the neighborhood. Former neighbors who had moved away after experiencing harassment came forward with their stories, creating a damning portrait of a woman who had appointed herself neighborhood gatekeeper based solely on racial criteria. Perhaps most significantly, other residents of Oakwood Heights began to speak out about the community's unspoken history of exclusion. An investigative piece in the Washington Post revealed that the neighborhood had been established in the 1952 with restrictive covenants that, while no longer legally enforceable, had shaped its demographic character for decades. Older residents acknowledged an unspoken understanding that certain families were not welcome, even after formal segregation had ended. "Eleanor Henderson wasn't an anomaly," explained Dr. Marlene Jefferson, a sociology professor, interviewed for the article. "She was simply the most visible manifestation of exclusionary attitudes that have persisted in many communities long after overtly discriminatory policies were struck down. What makes this case remarkable is that she targeted someone with enough power and visibility to bring consequences that most victims of racial profiling never receive." As public attention intensified, Eleanor finally secured legal representation. Her attorney, Martin Reynolds, attempted to shift the narrative away from racial motivation. "Mrs. Henderson was acting out of misguided concern for her community," he told reporters gathered outside the courthouse after her arraignment. "This case has been characterized unfairly in the media. We look forward to presenting all the facts in court." Those facts, however, continued to work against Eleanor as the investigation proceeded. Forensic examination of her computer revealed searches for information about removing undesirable neighbors and neighborhood property values. Decline minorities, further undermining claims that her actions weren't racially motivated. 10 days after the incident, Raymond announced a new policy initiative directly inspired by what had happened at his wedding. Standing in the governor's mansion press room, he introduced legislation that would create enhanced penalties for knowingly false emergency reports motivated by racial bias. What's been called living while black, incidents impose real costs, not just emotional trauma for those falsely reported, but tangible costs in emergency services diverted from genuine emergencies, Raymond explained. This legislation aims to create accountability and deterrence for those who weaponize emergency services based on racial animus. The proposed bill, quickly dubbed the Henderson Act by the media, received bipartisan support in the state legislature, with many lawmakers eager to associate themselves with a measure addressing such a visible incident of racial profiling. Political observers noted how skillfully Raymond had leveraged a personal affront into a substantive policy initiative with broad appeal. Amara, meanwhile, channeled her response in a different direction. Using her platform as both the governor's wife and a respected medical professional, she established the Collins Mitchell Foundation for Healthcare Equity, dedicated to addressing racial disparities in medical treatment and supporting minority students entering medical fields. My experience as both a doctor and a black woman has shown me how bias can literally be a matter of life and death in healthcare settings, she explained at the Foundation's launch event. We aim to create systemic change through research, education, and advocacy. As the legal proceedings against Eleanor Henderson continued and the policy responses to the incident took shape, what had begun as one woman's attempt to disrupt a wedding had instead sparked a meaningful statewide conversation about belonging bias and the persistent reality of racial profiling in everyday American life. The wedding that Eleanor had tried to prevent had not only proceeded despite her interference, but had become a powerful symbol of resilience in the face of prejudice. A beginning rather than an ending, and certainly not the outcome Eleanor had envisioned when she first picked up her binoculars and began monitoring the activity next door. 1 month after the wedding day that made national headlines, Governor Raymond Mitchell and his wife Dr. Amara Collins Mitchell hosted a community dinner at their family estate in Oakwood Heights. The event represented a deliberate choice to reclaim the space that had been the site of both celebration and confrontation, transforming it from a battleground back into a home. The guest list included neighbors, community leaders, and even some of the law enforcement officers who had responded to Eleanor Henderson's false alarm. Under twinkling lights strung through the ancient oak trees, people from diverse backgrounds shared a meal and conversation, embodying the inclusive community the Mitchells envisioned. Noticeably absent was Eleanor Henderson, who by then faced serious legal consequences for her actions. The district attorney had charged her with multiple counts of filing false reports, misuse of emergency services, and obstruction of justice. The FBI had added federal charges related to her false claims about threats to a government official. Her attorney had attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors, aware of the high-profile nature of the case and its significance as a precedent, showed little flexibility. Eleanor's public image had collapsed completely as media investigations uncovered her history of targeting minority residents with complaints and surveillance. Former neighbors came forward with stories of harassment that painted a damning portrait of a woman who had appointed herself neighborhood gatekeeper based solely on racial criteria. Even those who might have privately sympathized with her views distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with such overt discrimination in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association, which had once tacitly supported Eleanor's concerns about neighborhood standards, issued a formal apology to the governor and his family. We acknowledge that our community has not always lived up to its stated values of neighborliness and respect, their statement read. We are committed to ensuring that Oakwood Heights becomes truly welcoming to all residents regardless of background. To demonstrate this commitment, the association had invited Dr. Vivian Mitchell, Raymond's sister and a prominent civil rights attorney, to lead a series of community discussions about the neighborhood's history and future. James Parker, Eleanor's nephew, who had compromised his FBI position by conducting unauthorized database searches at her request, had been formally terminated after the Office of Professional Responsibility completed its investigation. Beyond losing his job, he faced potential criminal charges for misuse of federal resources. The case had become a cautionary tale within the Bureau about the dangers of allowing personal connections to override professional ethics. In a surprising development, James had reached out to Raymond through intermediaries, offering a complete account of his involvement and expressing genuine remorse. While this disclosure didn't mitigate the professional consequences he faced, it did provide valuable evidence for the case against Eleanor and demonstrated a level of accountability that his aunt had yet to show. Eleanor's husband Frank had filed for divorce after 38 years of marriage, unable to reconcile with a woman whose actions had revealed a character he could no longer support or excuse. He had moved permanently to his brother's home in another state, starting over at 65 with little more than clothing and personal mementos. The house in Oakwood Heights, once Eleanor's pride and the base of her self-appointed neighborhood surveillance, now stood empty and listed for sale, though realtors reported potential buyers were deterred by its notorious recent history. Walter Brooks, the retired history teacher who had briefly participated in Eleanor's scheme before recognizing its true nature, had become an unexpected ally in the community healing process. Working with Vivian Mitchell, he helped organize educational events about housing discrimination and the neighborhood's complex history. His willingness to acknowledge his mistake and work toward making amends provided a template for how others might engage in genuine reconciliation. I taught the civil rights movement for 30 years. Walter explained during one community forum but failed to recognize modern discrimination when I encountered it. That failure has been a powerful lesson in how prejudice adapts and disguises itself even to those who believe themselves immune. Raymond's proposed legislation addressing racially motivated false reports, now formally titled the Emergency Services Protection Act, but still colloquially known as the Henderson Act, had passed the state Senate with bipartisan support and awaited a vote in the House. The bill created enhanced penalties for knowingly false emergency reports, motivated by bias, while also establishing a task force to study patterns of discriminatory reporting across the state. Political analysts noted how skillfully Raymond had transformed a personal affront into meaningful policy that addressed a widespread but often overlooked form of racial harassment. Amara's Collins Mitchell Foundation for Healthcare Equity had secured significant initial funding from major medical institutions and was already awarding its first scholarships to minority students entering medical fields. The foundation also launched a research initiative examining disparities in pain management treatment across racial groups, an issue Amara had encountered repeatedly throughout her medical career. When I was in medical school, textbooks still contained myths about biological differences in pain perception between races, Amara explained in an interview about the Foundation's work. Those discredited ideas continue to influence treatment decisions with very real consequences for patients of color. As the community dinner at the Mitchell estate concluded with dessert, served beneath the same oak tree where Raymond and Amara had eventually exchanged their vows, the governor rose to address his guests. When my grandmother purchased this home after decades of working within it as a maid, she told me something I've never forgotten, Raymond said, his voice carrying across the attentive gathering. She said, "Raymond, ownership is not just about having your name on a deed. It's about belonging somewhere so completely that no one can make you feel like a visitor in your own space." He looked around at the diverse faces before him. That sense of belonging is what we're building here tonight, not just in this neighborhood, but across our state. The incident on our wedding day was painful, but it has catalyzed conversations and changes that might otherwise have taken years to achieve. Amara joined her husband, taking his hand as she added her perspective. In the operating room, I often tell my students that complications reveal character, both the character of the surgeon and the underlying condition of the patient. What happened here revealed difficult truths about persistent prejudice in our communities, but it also revealed the character of those willing to acknowledge these truths and work toward healing. As the evening concluded, guests departed with a renewed sense of possibility that even deeply entrenched patterns of exclusion could be transformed through accountability, education, and genuine community building. 2 empty chairs had been symbolically placed at the dinner, representing those still unable to join in this vision of inclusive community. Eleanor Henderson, isolated by her own prejudice and its consequences, and others like her who remained entrenched in perspectives that divided rather than united. The chairs stood as both an acknowledgement of work still to be done and an invitation to a different future. For Raymond and Amara, the evening represented a reclamation of joy that Eleanor Henderson had attempted to disrupt. Their wedding day had not proceeded as planned, but their commitment to each other and to building a more just community had only strengthened in the face of adversity. As the last guests departed, and they stood together beneath the ancient oak tree now illuminated by strings of soft lights, Raymond turned to his wife. "Not exactly the wedding day we imagined," he said with a gentle smile, "but perhaps exactly the beginning we needed." Amara nodded, leaning into his embrace. "A beginning that matters not just for us, but for many others. That makes it even more meaningful." Together they looked out over the property that had been the site of so much history, from his grandmother's years of service, to her groundbreaking purchase of the estate, to their disrupted wedding, and now to this evening of community, reconciliation. Through all of it, the land and home had stood as a testament to persistence, to belonging, and to the ongoing work of creating a society where everyone could truly feel at home. What would you do? If faced with prejudice in your own community, would you confront it directly or work behind the scenes for change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about racial profiling in everyday situations, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories that challenge us to examine our assumptions and build more inclusive communities. Thank you for listening, and remember that small actions of either prejudice or inclusion ripple outward in ways we might never fully comprehend. This story illuminates how deeply prejudice can distort perception, turning ordinary events into imagined threats when viewed through a biased lens. Eleanor's actions reveal how racism often disguises itself as concern about property values, security, or neighborhood standards. Her escalating surveillance demonstrates how unchecked bias can lead to dangerous consequences, not just for targets of discrimination, but for the perpetrator themselves. The contrast between Eleanor's isolation and the Mitchells' community building shows two possible responses to diversity: fear or embrace. Raymond and Amara's decision to transform their disrupted wedding into an opportunity for broader change illustrates how personal pain can fuel meaningful social progress when channeled constructively. Walter Brooks represents the possibility of growth and redemption, showing that acknowledging one's complicity in discrimination is the first step toward genuine change. Meanwhile, Frank Henderson's ultimate rejection of his wife's behavior reminds us that there comes a point where silence becomes complicity. Perhaps most importantly, the story underscores that belonging cannot be granted or withheld by self-appointed gatekeepers. True community requires recognizing every person's inherent right to exist in spaces without justification, explanation, or exceptional credentials to earn acceptance. Have you ever witnessed someone using their power or position to discriminate against others? Or perhaps you've experienced racial profiling firsthand in your own neighborhood. Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences might help others feel less alone in similar situations. If you believe everyone deserves to feel welcome in their own communities, regardless of their race, hit that like button right now. The more visibility these stories receive, the more awareness we can create about everyday discrimination that often goes unchallenged. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that expose injustice and celebrate resilience in the face of prejudice. Each subscription helps us continue sharing these important narratives that might otherwise remain untold. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Sometimes the most powerful way to change hearts and minds is through stories that help us see the world through another person's eyes. Thank you for listening. And remember, building truly inclusive communities begins with each of us examining our own biases and standing up against discrimination wherever we encounter it.